Hey, so one of the challenges with being a management professor is you got to keep up with all the changes that go on in the workforce. So the big one, obviously, for the last 15 years has been this emergence of the gig economy, starting early with things like elance.com, where people could do sort of freelance graphics design and translation services and some other stuff that was sort of easily moved quickly onto the web. And now more locally with things like Uber or food delivery services and these other ones, you've led to this discussion of the gig economy. And in particular, now that's evolved into people being able to swap shifts at retail stores and restaurants. A lot more on the individual and a lot less in the hands of a particular manager maybe than used to be. And in particular, those folks are normally treated, with the exception of the restaurants, and retail stores like Uber, people are explicitly treated as independent contractors, which means although the firm might incentivize them to come and be and work, they're not held to the same standards as a normal employer and employee relationship. Now, what's weird about this, of course, is that this is absolutely how the Industrial Revolution. This was how work used to be done, which was on this system whereby people would do a ton of work at their house. If you've ever been to a living history museum and you remember being bored out of your mind, you may have seen a loom in someone's house. And it looked kind of like an oddity that someone would have this weaving machine in their home. But what was weird was that all that normally existed. So people would have looms at their house, they would felt things at their house, and they would go to a market, they would buy up a bunch of raw material, they would take it to their house, they would work on it there, and then they would go back to the marketplace and then unload their goods. And this was how work got done. Even as the Industrial Revolution started to progress, you saw people moving away from this parceling out system. So um, this is labor hours worked per person in Britain. So you start to see sort of a basic level, which is maybe about 45 to 50 hours a week prior to the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution kicks, and all of a sudden now you're in factories. And factories, even today, are synonymous with long hours, sometimes maybe unpleasant working conditions. And certainly back then there was a lot of unpleasant working conditions because the only time that the labor hours per person started to go down was when you started to see large numbers of strikes and organized labor. Organized labor leads to slow declines in hours worked. War leads to the big drops in hours worked. The First World War was coinciding with huge declines in the initial hours worked per person, particularly the end of that war. Then you started to see World War II in the interwar period. World War II leads to even further declines in hours worked. And that's actually been on a steady decline in Britain for the last 70, 80 years. Whereas now, hours worked per person in Britain is as low as it's ever been. So here's a very developed, rich economy. And although we love to talk about how people are overworked in the modern era, they actually work less now than they did. And a big part of that, of course, is that a lot of work has started to move off into the periphery of the economy. No longer are we all working for IBM, where we go in and we work 8 to 8. A lot of us now are working on sort of these flex hours or flex jobs where we show up, we work a shift, and we go home, and maybe we don't come back for 2 or 3 days. A lot of folks, including, are working 2 or 3 jobs to try to sort of piece together some hours. And that's not a terribly resilient way to live, but it's not inconsistent with how people would live prior to the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, prior to the revolution, then, and revolution was sort of a figurative term, which was aggregation of machines and capital led to the need for large quantities of labor. Large quantities of labor got pulled into industrial towns. Those industrial towns led to big consolidations, which led to longer hours because now those people don't really have a tremendously good bargaining position relative to the machine because they live in the town that's funded by the factory and so on. Wages went up as workers went to the factory, so this was probably a positive outcome. Early careers and livelihoods and variability because all of their eggs were in a single employer basket. And they were working nights and not being around family became not unusual starting in the Industrial Revolution all the way up until the 1940s and 1950s, at least in the United States. What's weird is the gig economy is actually pushing people back towards more flexible working arrangements. where now I can work on the weekends and nobody's the wiser or nobody really bothers to worry about it. I can work late at night. I can work early in the morning, kind of depending on my own skill set. The COVID crisis has led a lot of salaried employees to look a hell of a lot more like gig employees, and it's not always a bad thing. So, if I'm a normal American worker, I might work 8 to 5 on average. I may have a 45-minute to an hour commute each day, so I'm spending 45 to 50 hours a week at work, and I'm spending another 10 hours a week invested in getting back and forth to work. So I'm going to miss a big part of other things that could be going on in life, if nothing else, because of that 10 hours I'm wasting just in the car absorbing podcasts, right? So working from home gives people a little bit more flexibility, so you can go see your kid's soccer game and then make up those hours later at night. If you go to a concert late at night on Thursday and you're a little hungover on Friday, again, as long as the work's getting done, it's not a big deal. The challenge has been for managers to try to break up the work so that it's more accommodating to that kind of approach. In a Zoom world, I can't watch people 24 hours a day to make sure they're being productive. So instead, I'm more focused on objectives and projects than I ever have been in the past, and certainly a lot more in terms of hand holding and being kind. The problem, of course, is that now that I'm in the Zoom world where everybody is completing projects for me, I'm going to place a heavy premium on the skills and talents that those people have to provide to the project. And at any point in time, if there's no talent or project that I want to put them on, they're pretty easy to replace because I can just find another person to get on Zoom. So one of the challenges with the COVID crisis is it might lead to a lot more competition for middle and upper skilled labor because now everybody's imminently replaceable. Big emphasis for you going forward then should be to really think hard about the skills that you're acquiring and to make sure that you keep those skills fresh because you don't want to become atrophied and you don't want to end up in a place where suddenly the Zoom calls just don't come in anymore.